Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. This is the fourth of 7 events in our series, Envisioning a Livable Future, which we've organized to mark the 10th anniversary of Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si on care for our common home. My name is Sister Catherine Feely, and I serve as the director of the Center for Service Learning and Social Action here at John Carroll. John Carroll is hosting this series in collaboration with the Hank Center at Loyola University in Chicago. And I want to thank the Hank Center's director, Michael Murphy, for his partnership in this endeavor. I also want to thank my John Carroll colleagues who are here from the committee this evening, and especially my co-conspirator, Bernard Prusek. They have made this series possible. Bernard holds the university's Raymond and Eleanor Smiley Chair in Business Ethics, and part of the work of this conference is to engage this topic on Laudato Si from a variety of perspectives. Our topic this evening is environmental politics, and for the first time in this series, we've assembled all of our speakers here in person. For those of you who are joining us by Zoom, we welcome your questions and invite you to use the Q&A box to submit your questions throughout the presentation. Bernard will be monitoring those. For those here in the auditorium with us, you should have received a note card, and there's some here in the front, so that you can write your questions and submit those when we get to the Q&A portion of our program this evening. And finally, tonight's event will be moderated by John Carroll's journalist in residence, former NBC News correspondent Pete Williams. Pete, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. We have 3 speakers to hear from this evening, and I'll introduce them one by one, and I'll start with Philip Stoddard. You would not think that somebody who urges people to think about abandoning their Florida beachfront houses would be politically popular there, but Philip Stoddard was elected mayor of South Miami 5 times and undoubtedly could have been reelected if he had chose to run again, but he instead chose to step down. He's a biology professor emeritus at Florida International University. He's proof that science and politics can mix, making his city one of the greenest in the nation. In 2015, midway through his service as mayor, he was appointed by the White House to develop national policy for dealing with rising sea levels. And he's a big promoter of renewable energy, and he leads by example because both his car and his house are powered by the sun. Not his sun, the sun. Politico named him one of America's leading thinkers, doers, and visionaries who are transforming American politics. And he's an expert on controlling something that Miami has a lot of, and that's mosquitoes. Philip?
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. So I want to talk to you for just a few minutes here about how you make progress in social action when the odds are stacked against you, or you feel like they are. And just real briefly here, show of hands, how many folks are students? So, and a bunch of you are not students. Okay, so well, for those who are students, thanks for coming. I know what it's like trying to do a bunch of things. Obviously, you don't have a major exam tomorrow, or you probably would be cramming for that, except for the folks with computers on in the back who probably do. And you have my sympathies. But here's how you do it. To start with, you follow Phil's 90% rule. And that is that you pick one area where you would like to make a dent, and you put 90% of your activism effort into that one thing, your one thing. And you devote the other 10% of your time to helping your friends with their 90%. Because it takes a bunch of people to make progress, but it takes a few experts and leaders to choose the way. And so it doesn't have to be exactly 90-10. It can be 80-20 or 70-30, whatever works for you. But you have to divide it up both ways, because it takes a community to make progress, and it takes people with know-how to make progress. So when you finally pick your area, you learn everything about it. You learn the laws and the statutes, the case law, your supporters, your opponents, who are the moneyed interests, who are the lobbyists. and you study them. You study all of that. And if you're 10%, you're going to show up when people have a protest, when people have a hearing, when they need folks to be in the crowd, someone to stand up and speak for 2 minutes at a public meeting, you come there for them. So I'm going to talk to you just for a few minutes about 2 people who made a difference in areas that I care about. One of them young and one of them old. And the young one is my friend Delaney Reynolds. And I met Delaney when she was 15. And she'd started an online climate awareness newsletter. And it's still going. She's now, she's in her probably late 20s. But it's called MiamiSeaRise.com. Write this down, MiamiSeaRise, one word, .com. Look it up. See what Delaney's doing, because she's a great model. So Delaney wrote to all the local mayors and said, hey, would you consider requiring solar in your city? And I'd been thinking about that too, because the city in San Francisco had done it. The city of San Francisco had done it. And so I said, sure, but you got to help me write it. And she says, Mayor Stoddard, I don't know anything about writing laws. I said, well, you're going to learn. So her dad brought her over to the house, and we sat down and wrote the first ordinance outside of California requiring solar on new residential construction. And Delaney was there to help me lobby for it against the utilities and the building lobbyists. And we got it through. And the price of solar stocks went up in China the next day. It had a global impact overnight. And so Delaney then became the lead plaintiff of a bunch of kids who were suing the state of Florida for not meeting its own climate goals. And they actually won the suit. And then the legislature, negated it by passing a law that said the state of Florida didn't have to follow its own goals. But in high school and college, Delaney was invited to address the United Nations and attend the COP meetings. She just graduated from law school, studying environmental law, and now she's doing her doctorate in ecosystem science and policy. And she's teeing up another climate lawsuit. This one, she's coming after the Public Services Commission in Florida for basically the same thing, not doing what they're charged with doing, which is looking after the public interests in utility law. They're totally captured by the utilities. So it's important to sort of think about the scope of your issue. You can think globally, but act locally. So Delaney's sort of been working at the state level, but it's an important state, Florida. It's a big one. And she attends international forums. But you can also work really locally. And I had a friend who passed away 3 years ago named Bob Welsh. And Bob Welsh is the same age, is or was the same age as my wife, so he's not that old. But Bob was a small-time builder in South Miami. He built houses with his own 2 hands, but he became a local folk hero. And he did more for climate in my county than any other individual, the most successful climate activist in Miami-Dade County. And he did it in a way you wouldn't expect. Does anybody know what's like the one thing you can do that will make the biggest climate difference in your actual life? Any guesses? It's planting trees. And it's not that hard. Bob planted trees. He planted little trees in little cups and he grew them up and then he gave them to people. He went to people's houses, knocked on the doors. Would you like a couple of oak trees? And so he planted about 3 trees a day for about 150, 200 days out of the year. He would do this. And in Miami, we're on limestone. So he brought along a generator, an electric jackhammer, punched the holes, sifted the soil to get the rocks out, planted these trees. He had this special shuffle he would do to stamp the dirt down. And if people didn't want an oak tree in their yard, he'd say, well, how about a mango tree? Because in some of the low-income communities, people don't want the responsibility of caring for a shade tree, but they'll take a fruit tree. So he got mango trees in. When he planted all the oaks that people could stand, he started planting Dade County pines, our native pine tree, and planted those. And so Bob passed away a few years ago of skin cancer, but his trees are still growing, and they're getting bigger all the time. But Bob went beyond that. He had a blue bicycle, blue girl's bike. We put a basket on the front, and he would make these political flyers just telling people in South Miami what was going on locally. And they were single spaced edge to edge, photocopied black and white, and he would deliver one to every single person, every single residence in the city on his bike. Took him a few days to do it. And he became known as Bicycle Bob, and people trusted him because he didn't have an agenda, just like trying to do the right thing. And so at some point, Bob decided to run for city commission. I was mayor at the time, and when I was running for city commission, people said, "You must be okay because Bob says you're okay," and I trust him. But he ran, and his entire campaign cost him $300, which was the cost of 2 flyers. He ran and got elected on 2 flyers because he had built such trust and goodwill with his information based, Bob flyers. And Bob loved protesting. He would show up at protests. Bob had been he called himself a Reagan Republican. He'd been inspired by Reagan. He went to put himself through college, political science. And then he became a Democrat because he concluded the Republicans were no longer looking after people's interests. But he took a particular dislike to Marco Rubio and Donald Trump. And he would show up at their rallies and make fun of them. And he discovered that Bob had a quirky sense of humor. And usually the people he was skewering thought he was supporting them because they didn't get his sense of humor. He'd sit there, he'd have his guitar out and his PA system, and he'd be singing songs he'd written and stuff. What a character. So when he passed away, we had a memorial service for him. And I wanted his chairs because he had these great chairs that were sort of a community asset. And these 2 guys in pinstripe suits come up and said, "You were mentioned in Bob's will." And I said, "I'd like his chairs." He said, "It's a bit more than that, 6 figures." And it said, but there's a line in his will that says, "To raise as much political hell as he can." So I've got this Bob Welsh fund that I use for raising political hell to this day. So, so that's kind of what you can do. You can sort of take any route. You can sort of, take on the political establishment in a large sense or in a small sense. But if you're sincere and you're willing to work like hell and earns people's trust, you can move mountains, even if it's one wheelbarrow full at a time.
Let me ask you a couple of questions before we go on. First of all, did Bob earn a living? I mean, what was he doing when he wasn't showing up at political events and planting trees?
So Bob described himself as independently middle class. Bob bought cheap lots back when they existed, and he built a house on each one of them with his own 2 hands, and then he rented them out. And they were ugly, but they were really, really well made, and so they required very little maintenance. So he earned rents on them, and he maintained them, but they didn't take much maintenance because he built them so well. So he had a few rental incomes, and he had simple tastes. Bob's idea of lunch out was Taco Bell, and if you wanted to really treat him to something fancy, you could take him to Chipotle.
And I guess the second question is, how do you decide what your 90% project is? I mean, I think it would come naturally to somebody who is already bothered by something in their community. But if you don't have a checklist of things that are bothering you, how do you make some decisions about where you can make a difference?
I think everybody I know has a checklist, but sometimes the checklists are long. I mean, it's a great question. And how do you pick it? Well, I tell people, if you have decent luck, health-wise, life is long, and you could do many things, but it doesn't mean doing them all at once. So maybe pick the thing. I always tell people, pick a problem small enough to be able to take on and big enough to matter. And so I think maybe use that between your passion and sort of tractability. You can pick one, and it may be that you pick something else later. You make a dent in this one, and you pick up the next one. But you do have to focus, and you do have to make that choice.
All right, thank you very much. We're going to have some of your questions a little later, but let's move on to Jesus Sanchez. The idea of putting big parks inside cities really developed in the mid-19th century to help residents in densely populated areas experience the peace and restorative powers of nature. Parks also brought people together, bringing bridging economic and racial divides. Jesus Sanchez has dedicated his career to encouraging conservation, environmental education, and access to urban green spaces. He was born in Puerto Rico, raised in Northeast Ohio. He has a master's in biology from an institution called John Carroll University. He has, let's hear it for Northeast Ohio. He has helped young people working with Cleveland Botanical Gardens, the Green Corps Program, Esperanza, Cleveland Metro Parks, and alongside staff members at the National Park Service. And he's now the program director for the Great Lakes Environmental Justice Grant Program at an organization called Restore America's Estuaries, which is dedicated to restoring and preserving coastal habitats. Mr. Sanchez.
Oh, thank you so much. I wanted to start, I wanted to build on this idea of the individual into community. And something that Phil mentioned that really stuck with me was this, and we asked a question about it, was the 90-10 rule, right? And what struck me about that is that 90%, and you take that 10% and you help someone else, right? And then there's other people with their 90%. And finding those others that have similar 90% to yours, right? What's your goal? What's your individual goal? And in that sense, helping each other, you're building community. And so, in my bio, much of my work and my efforts has been around and centered in community. And so I'm reminded of when I came to Northeast Ohio and permanently relocated. I grew up in Lorain, Ohio, if anybody's familiar. It's about 45 minutes west of this town. It's a steel town. It was built on industry. So as a child, when we first came here, I remember these stories of the lake and the river, right? And how we didn't go down. You don't go down there. You don't go down to the water. There's fish with 3 heads, right? There's pollution. There's all these things, and you don't touch it, right? And I mention this because I go back there today, and Lorain still has its issues, right? It's never fully recovered from some of the closing and of the steel industries and the industry there that were the main economic stimulus and jobs of the community. But there's some areas there that have really developed. The metro parks, right? The Black River, the lakefront, those are pleasant places to be now. And that was all done through initiatives that required support, from the government, federal, state, and otherwise. And so that brings me to the work that I'm doing with Restore America's Estuaries. And a little background on the organization itself. It's been around since 1995. It's primarily been focused on coastal communities throughout the United States. And so it's comprised of an alliance of organizations, in Northeast United States, Florida, and along the coast in California. And so much of the restoration efforts and habitat stabilization efforts have been along those communities. And so I'm the first member of this organization to be in the Great Lakes community with an effort to recognize the vast coastal communities, quote unquote, that we have throughout our Great Lakes region, throughout these 8 states. It's talking about millions of people that live along the Great Lakes region. And so this organization, Restore America's Estuaries, that I'm with, receives support, and many of the programs and restoration projects that we do come from federal funding. They're appropriated. They're Congress approved every time the cycle comes to approve that budget. And so that goes back into these communities to identify what are those environmental issues and impacts that those communities want to address, right? And so that's where that opportunity for that 90% comes in, because if that's important to you, our organization works with individuals on the community level, on a local level, to identify those. And so my project is Great Lakes Environmental Justice Grant Program. It's being renamed to the Great Lakes Restoration Grant Program. We were provided over $1 billion, not our organization, but to the Great Lakes. Over $1 billion was allocated to keep, restoring habitat, keep our water clean. the largest freshwater source on the planet, and to continue those efforts. My effort, my focus was community-based, is community-based. And it's through a community partner that we have in Toledo, Ohio, to do outreaches, which is something that I've always done in my local community, is on the ground level, is to interact with people, to meet with people, to identify their needs, listen, and to ensure that those things are being carried out in the work and in the programs that we do. And so that's where I'm at is, we're here. Right now things aren't moving as quickly as you can imagine as we would want them to. But that doesn't change the focus and the goal in terms of these habitats and these ecosystems that are important to everyone. And so, it's that community aspect that's extremely important, is that we have the opportunity, I have the opportunity to work with organizations throughout the region on a very local level to identify those needs and for them to receive support through my organization, whether it's capacity or skills. The intent behind this is to really create access, not only to that funding, but to those opportunities for them to make an impact on their communities and see it the way they envision it. And so that comes through a grant award and a grant program.
Can you give us some examples of, you want the community to get involved to do what? I mean, how do communities' involvement help people actually restore the estuary and make the water better?
Yeah, well, fun fact, I don't know how many estuaries are, we're called Restore America's Estuaries, but I think there's only 2 estuaries maybe throughout the Great Lakes region that I'm aware of. Old Women's Creek, that's an estuary, I believe, in Ohio. That's a great question, because the intent and effort and what we've done and modeled this program after has been through working with grassroots level organizations, community-based organizations that are already doing the work in some capacity, whether it's advocacy, whether it is restoration or education. So those are avenues that individuals can get involved in, is seeking out some of those organizations in your community, right? If environmental action is something that you're interested in, what organization is doing that in your community and how can you get involved? Whether it's planting trees on the ground level, right? Or volunteering for educational programs and building the stewards and the leaders of the, the conservation environmental movement of tomorrow.
Because I asked the question because it seems like cleaning up a lake would be a huge chore. And one of the things you would be trying to do is reduce the sources of pollution or restore the chemical balance or whatever it is. And how does an individual do anything to make a difference on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And so this is part of a large initiative called the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. Has anybody ever heard of that? It's been around for 20 years. It's, very, very well, supported in terms of bipartisan support. It's the reason why we've come so far in terms of cleaning up our lakes and creating, pollution-free, quote unquote, areas. Still a long way to go. But, to your point, there's ways to get involved, again, on an individual level. I think an example I can have, because I work with an organization called Junction Coalition in Toledo, Ohio. I'm not sure if you all are familiar with them, but their executive director is an amazing leader, Alicia Smith. She's our partner organization on this work. And their organization was birthed from an algal bloom water crisis in Toledo, Ohio. So this was in 2014, 2015. There's a large algal bloom which caused an impact on the water, the drinking water access. And so people were without water. And so they came together to support each other in that effort, right? So people were taking trips out of town, getting water, getting access, figuring out together. But ultimately that organization was birthed from them contributing out of their own pockets, right? Some financial contribution, but it was like some small amount that was not unreasonable to help support the work of this organization. But I think there's simple things that, to Phil's point, that you can do on your own, that help mitigate some of those things. And some of that is just creating education and awareness, within yourself.
All right, let's bring in our third speaker and then hear from you all talking to each other. But I want to bring in Alexandra Nichols. She knows all about Cleveland's hundreds of public parks, playgrounds, and swimming pools. She can tell you all about them. She grew up in Shaker Heights, where she ran the recreation department, and she's worked for the Parks and Rec Department in New York City and Avon Lake, and she has served as director of Cleveland's Department of Parks and Recreation as well. She's worked for the YMCA of Greater Cleveland and the National Recreation and Parks Association. She's also on the board of the North Union Farmers Market, which proudly boasts that unlike other places that call themselves farmers markets, their produce is actually raised by the farmers who sell it, and maybe her service on that board was inspired by her own love of cooking. Alexandria.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here today. You know, when I was first invited to participate on this panel discussion talking about envisioning a livable future, I thought, what does that have to do for parks and recreation? People often don't think about parks and recreation when we think about sustainability and climate change. And, you know, my curiosity was, why was I invited to speak? And why from this lens? You know, when we think about parks and recreation, it's not typically the first thing most people associate with climate action. Most folks think about fun and games, outdoor recreation, sports, community events. So how does that connect to a livable future? And why should we be part of these critical conversations? I thought back to my childhood. My parents were both actively involved in political campaigns. They were both worked in social services. They shared stories of their involvement in the civil rights movement and constantly advocated for people who needed support. Watching them taught me at an early age that public service was important, whether it was civil service or social justice or civil rights. It was about uplifting the most vulnerable people in our communities. That same spirit carries into parks and recreation, and our work is more than just providing leisure activities. It's about creating equitable access to wellness, safety, and joy. It's about quality of life. Sure, we offer sports, community picnics, fitness classes, playgrounds, park trails, a variety of outdoor experiences, but our reach is far deeper. We maintain tree canopies that provide shade, healthy air in our neighborhoods, and helps to reduce the heat in our urban neighborhoods as well. We offer warming and cooling centers in the city of Cleveland, and these offer shelter for our residents in times of extreme weather. We prioritize sustainability practices in our park management, and we provide out-of-school time programs, meal programs, social service programs. Yep, we even teach people how to swim. I can vividly remember, most of you weren't even born, the power outage of 2003. Happened August 14th. It was a hot summer day. I remember driving home from the west side to the east side, and I saw every single traffic light out, and I knew something major had happened. I called my mother. She was living in New York City. I said, sure, she can get the news. She'll tell me what's going on. She didn't answer. Called my father. He was living in South Carolina. And he said, well, let me look online real quick. He looked online and he let out a big guffaw and said, looks like both you and your mother don't have power. That power outage spanned from the Midwest to the East Coast. It was huge. Well, at that time, I was living with my sister. I got home. I said, you know, Selena, let's go up to the store and get some food. Grabbed our backpacks. We walked about a block to the grocery store looking for food and water. We were lucky. We lived near the grocery store. We lived near public transportation. We had money for emergency food in times of need. We had a yard with a full tree canopy that provided shelter in times of heat. We also had a grill, so we could cook outside. We didn't have to worry about heating up the house. We didn't know when our power was going to come back on. Best of all, we were avid campers. We had coolers, lanterns, and a whole variety of camping gear. So that helped us get us through. But not everyone has those resources. That day taught me the value of an urban tree canopy, walkable neighborhoods, Having hobbies like camping can build resistance, and living close to a grocery store. It taught me how deeply our environmental conditions shape people's experiences and their lives. These types of weather events aren't getting any better. Just this weekend, we had devastating floods. We had crops that were destroyed, houses that were destroyed, lives that were upended. These types of weather events are going to continue, and the consequences will continue to be more devastating. That's why our role in Parks and Recreation matters more now than ever. We help communities understand and enjoy the value of natural resources. We provide opportunities to connect with nature, to learn, to heal, to thrive. A livable future means people have clean air, safe spaces to go in the event of emergency, and social services in times of need. Opportunities for joy and connections in the outdoors. It means people are empowered to live well, even in our changing climate. Park and Recreation is not just about a livable future, but it is essential to a livable future. Thank you.
Let me ask you a question. You've had so much experience, and there's Alexandria's family right there. You've had a lot of experience in dealing with municipal parks in different places. Do parks have to fight for budgets when the city is hurting for money and is trying to reduce the workforce?
That's such a great question, and it's something that I talk about often. I, in fact, had a conversation just today in my office, and I said, you know, when we think about city services and what's most important, people think police, fire, public works, trash pickup, Parks and Recreation. And so safety services always will be number one. Having those other public works type services will always be important, but it's also important that we uplift the value of Parks and Recreation and the ability to continue to provide people a high quality of life. We do have to negotiate wisely when it comes to budget season, whether that's negotiating for operating budgets or operating for capital dollars.
You know, there's organizations that support national parks, the Friends of the Parks. You know, I'm from Wyoming. We have some significant parks there, and there are people that raise money and protect the parks. Are there similar organizations that help and support municipal parks?
Absolutely. Some are very formal groups. There are friends groups, a bunch of smaller friends groups within the city of Cleveland. A lot of municipalities and urban park districts have friends groups that do support financially and through volunteer time our park and recreation initiatives. I would also add that we also see informal support. I often get requests, just got another request today. Hey, we'd love to come clean up a park. How can we help? And so those types of services are important. I believe I've had John Carroll students come out, different fraternal or sorority type groups and other clubs. They like to help, they like to give in, and we are a beneficiary of those in-kind services.
Let me ask you and Jesus a question. Compared to other major cities, how does Cleveland do in terms of being park conscious, park aware, and having sufficient green space?
I would actually go back to what Bill said earlier. Back in the early part of the 1900s, people really started to prioritize parks and green space. In urban areas, we're familiar with some large parks. Central Park is one of them. Frederick Law Olmsted had a landscape architecture firm, and they designed a lot of parks. We have parks here in Northeast Ohio designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. Cleveland Metro Parks was founded in the early part of the 19th century, and it was about preserving and protecting the water along our riparian ways, along all of our rivers. We call it the Emerald Necklace for a reason. We call it that because it protects, kind of in a necklace around Lake Erie. All of that water flows into the lake. So I think Cleveland has an abundance of green space, and I think that's fantastic.
You agree, Jesus? All right, let me.
I got to jump in here and say
Please
one
do.
more thing, and that is, you know, as a former mayor, I can tell you that your Parks and Rec programs are some of the best things you got for public safety. I mean, you want a good police force, and I've got my own definition of that. But your Parks and Recs programs keep a lot of teenagers out of trouble. So idle hands are the devil's playthings. And, they keep people healthy, they keep people safe. It's really a it covers multiple branches, multiple, callings for government all in one. It's just, it's way more important than people realize.
And Jesus, do you think that parks fulfill their mission of bridging cultural, racial, economic divides, bringing people together? Are they good at that?
I think, yes, I think they have the potential for that, right? So one thing that came to my mind is that I do think that Northeast Ohio has a very robust park system. Cleveland Metro Parks, 30,000 plus acres and growing. There's efforts in that initiative to make connections in the inner city and through Cleveland and kind of connect this vision of connecting each park, right, seamlessly. The national park as well too, right? That's unheard of to have such a large space, a national park near an urban area, or between two urban areas if you include Akron in that. What I would say is that there's still a lot of work to be done to make those spaces and places inclusive, right? And that people feel safe and welcome in those spaces, right? And I say that because I'll give you an experience that I had was I was part of a group and we were doing a tour down in the Kinsman neighborhood, and there's like this old land that's kind of gated, and I'm not sure if it's Burton Bell Carr Community Development Corporation, that's kind of their zone. And we were doing a tour because there's this vision of this becoming like this green oasis. It's near the Riddall Green Partnership. But there's this bridge, this old bridge that was abandoned there that used to connect the Kinsman neighborhood and I believe the Slavic Village neighborhood. That bridge was burned, right, during the civil rights movements, because predominantly, Kinsman was a black neighborhood, Slavic Village was a predominantly Slovenian white neighborhood, and they didn't want those kids crossing that path, right? So there's those historical contexts in terms of certain spaces. Coming out of that park, I remember these kids were playing, or that space, I remember these kids were playing basketball, and they're like, what do we come out of, we almost like came out of the woods out of nowhere, kind of startled them. But they're like, what are y'all doing down there? You're not supposed to go down there because there's bears down there, right? And those are stories and things that are passed and given as a way to remain safe, to remain away from those spaces. So while they can and they have that potential, and there's a lot of examples that there is, especially in our community, I think there's still a lot of opportunity to create and bridge those cultural and social divides.
Let me ask you all three about the elephant in the room, and that is the current administration doesn't perhaps share your values on environmentalism and conservation. Mr. Trump's EPA administrator says the administration is, quote, driving a dagger through the heart of the climate change religion and ushering in America's golden age. So how much of a difference do administration policies make on what you all are trying to do? Alexandria, let me start with you. We'll just come down here and then with you, Phil, on that question.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fabulous question as well. When we think about funding for park and recreation services, whether it's for programming or facilities or parks, it is not the best funding model for parks and recreation services. And so it's oftentimes we need to get grant funding from the state government and from the federal government. And late last year, the city of Cleveland was awarded, I believe, $3.4 million, and it was for an urban forest. And the whole point of this was to do a tree inventory and to do a tree management plan so that we can improve the quality of the urban forest for air quality, shade in the times of extreme heat. And as soon as our current president was elected, that money went on hold. And so we thought, wow, how can we get this work done? We don't have $3.4 million to spend on a tree canopy. We know we need to improve our tree canopy, but how are we going to do this? And so just knowing we might lose that federal funding could be potentially devastating, because we would have to be very creative, and it would take some time to pivot and find that kind of money in order to fund the improvement to our urban tree canopy.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the grant program that I oversee is, federal funding directly. We work very closely with the EPA, specifically the Great Lakes National Program Office. And, we look to them, for guidance in terms of what that looks like and how we can move this effort forward. There's just a lot of uncertainty in terms of what that looks like moving forward. And there's not a lot of information currently available in terms of what that is or what that guidance is from the EPA. I think, a lot of people are just in this area, the space of limbo, right? And trying to figure out what the next steps are and trying to plan ahead and create, different types of, I guess, scenarios in terms of, if it goes this way, what's the most extreme in terms of what happens. The intent of this program, again, was to really identify environmental justice communities, right? And so what does that look like going forward is the big question right now.
It means is they're stealing your future from each one of you. The planet that you live on, that you're going to grow up on, is going to be worse because of what's happening now. It's theft. It's absolute theft. It's immoral. And it's incumbent upon all of us to call it out as immoral. We know that's the case. Speaking of the Pope's encyclical, he got it right. It is our moral calling to fix the planet, to heal the planet, to do the best we can for the planet and for each other and for our children. This is the most immoral thing I've seen in my lifetime. It has to be called out as such, and it's our duty to stand up and say as much. Now, what can you do? Let's talk about this pivot. Bob Welsh. Bob Welsh planted 5,000 trees or 6,000 trees. He lost count. But, I mean, we got some biologists in the house? Can I see a show of hands? How many biologists we got here? All right, can anybody tell me, why does a tree make your neighborhood cooler? When you drive into South Miami, where I live, from the surrounding area, the temperature drops 10 degrees. It should be dropping 15. Why is that? What does a tree do that makes it cooler? It transpires. So a leaf has these little pores on it, and water comes up through the roots and it evaporates off the leaf. It's a little evaporative cooler, just like having a wet washcloth you're waving around.
Stomata.
The stomata open up and water vapor goes out. That's right. Anyway, it works as a little evaporative cooler, and you got a gazillion leaves on a gazillion trees, and you got a big evaporative cooling system, and it drops your temperature. So it makes shade, which is nice. And it's actually physically cooling the atmosphere. They're great. So the pivot is the Bob Welsh strategy. Bob did this on a shoestring. And imagine reorganizing to teach communities how to grow and plant their own trees. Every elementary school, every middle school, every high school, you can be planting trees. Have contests, who can plant the most trees. Have tree planting celebrations. I mean, we do this for Arbor Day, right? But let's do it all the time. That's what Bob did. And you can do it. Now, it does take some staff time, but the resources are pretty small, and people will even pay you for the tree. Bob didn't charge folks, but he said, if you want to contribute, fine, because he's got, his little plastic pots and soil and stuff. It's not very expensive. But if you're going to do it on an institutional scale, yeah, you got a big staff operation. Same thing for lakes restoration. Is the best thing I can do for restoring. I work on Biscayne Bay, which is where I live. We don't have a Great Lake. But we got the Everglades in Biscayne Bay. We're worried about stuff flowing into the bay. So you build bioswales in your front yard to intercept everything that could run off, and you do that on the streets as well. So, there's individual actions, and teaching people how to do it and helping them do it to clean the water that's coming in. I mean, this can be community shoestring efforts, but it all adds up if you do it. And so if we can't do the big projects, you know, which need to be done to decarbonize, there were some big projects, big tax incentives to make things work on a large scale. We can still do them on the neighborhood scale, and those neighborhoods add up. And they keep people aware too, so they pay an extra dividend in terms of social engagement and political awareness. So that's what we got to be doing. If we can't be doing the big scale stuff, we got to be doing the small scale stuff on a big scale. And so if each of us goes into our neighborhoods and starts doing the small scale stuff and getting people to help us, we'll keep that movement alive and we'll make progress at the same time.
Can I just ask you about what we can individually do? I mentioned that your house and your car are solar powered. I mean, how hard is that to do?
You make money doing it. That's the thing people don't get is, like, I pay $30 a month for electricity, and that's only because the utility managed to jack up the minimum charge. It pays me 12% internal rate of return on my investment. That's a fixed rate of return because the sun comes up most days. So it's like having a government bond paying 12%. If I could guide those, I'd put all my retirement funds into that. That's what my roof does for me with solar. And people don't get that. You got to get a good price. So we negotiated a group price on solar. It's called the South Miami discount. And then we started got the solar co-op movement to come down to South Florida. And I continue to fund that. So we get, like, 4 different counties get solar discounts because we keep this solar co-op going. I don't know if you got a solar co-op here, but Solar United Neighbors does solar co-ops all over the country. And you could start one here in Cleveland if you don't have one. SolarUnitedNeighbors.org. They'd be really happy to set up shop here if you don't already have a solar co-op. So there's ways to do it.
Anybody know what April 20, these people will know, but let me ask you, anybody know what April 22nd is? Earth Day. All right. And the first one was 55 years ago. So I want to ask you all to answer this question. Has enough been done after 55 years? And if not, why not? Alexandria, you can answer this question for us. What the heck happened?
It's interesting. It's interesting to think of that concept. And I can remember back when I first started getting involved in Parks and Recreation as a college student and thinking about a career, I always valued the natural resources. My parents always valued the natural resources. It's a value. And I think that's the bottom line. Not everybody values it as a resource. And have we done enough? I would say absolutely not. I think some of it is a fear. People don't know what to do. We don't know what we don't know. I think some of it is apathy. People say, yeah, well, climate, change is getting worse, but what can I do? And so people don't know. And so they sit. I want to say that I don't feel like people really understand our elected officials are just that. Federal, state, local, county, you name it. They are elected officials. They are elected by us. Anybody's welcome to call an elected official and voice their opinion. I don't think that it is that well known that people can call elected officials. They all care about what their constituents think. And so that's an opportunity, but I think we have to pay attention. We have to teach it as a value. And I think part of what Parks and Recreation can do is help educate people so that it becomes a value. And hopefully, as we move into the future, younger generations will see it as a value.
Yeah. I think of it as, well, my short answer is no. I think a lot of it is backtracking, right? So you think of like the development of this country and creating highways and automobiles and all these things that were like, technology and the technology boom. And what's happened is that we've separated our natural environment from this built environment. And now we're looking for ways and solutions to reintegrate the natural environment into these built environments, right? That through reforesting efforts, through community gardens. And so there's a lot more work that needs to be done in that regard. And much of that, you know, is both intentional, right, for certain communities, but again, going that to community level, it's like, what's going to be best for those neighborhoods, those residents, and those particular communities.
Let me amend the question to you, if I may, Philip. I think it's pretty clear that you're a person who has strong feelings and a lot of energy and drive for this. You also had an issue that people couldn't ignore in South Florida, and that's rising sea levels. Could you have been just as successful in Kansas City or Indianapolis or Fairbanks, Alaska?
You know, I stumbled into something completely by mistake, but I'm going to hit the pause on myself for a sec and just come back to the previous one. My wife was really inspired by that first Earth Day. She was 17. It electrified her. She became an architect, but when I first met her, she said, you know, we got to make cities wonderful places so people really want to live there. So they'll leave the countryside and the natural areas alone. But I do take heart in that there are so many more environmental conservation organizations when I was a kid. I mean, a movement has grown up. Sure, there's more to do, but we got a movement, a big movement, and it matters to so many people. We just got to keep moving it, right? But yeah, I stumbled into something funny. I was elected mayor of South Miami. Now, for those who don't know, South Miami is the size of a postage stamp. But people who don't live in locally hear the word Miami and they think South Miami is just like the south half of Miami, so it must be pretty big. And so you got the name mayor and Miami, and they thought I was a big deal. And so when I would say something, like I'd say something to a reporter, and it would make national news, and then international news. I mean, I had a reporter from The Guardian show up to talk to me because I was starting to get a reputation. And he said, well, what do you
don't mean the baseball team, you mean the
newspaper.
The newspaper, yes.
The newspaper, The Guardian. And, and so he says to me, well, Senator Marco Rubio says that the climate is always changing. What do you say to that? I said, oh, Marco Rubio's an idiot. And he said, can I quote you on that? And I thought for a moment, and I said, well, I'm not the first, so sure, go ahead. So they're on the front page of The Guardian. Mayor of South Miami says, Marco Rubio's an idiot. Like, headline. And I had an international reputation overnight. And the world beat a path to my door after that. And of course, they ran to Marco Rubio and said, hey, Mayor Stoddard says you're an idiot. What do you say to that? And Rubio was brilliant. He said, the mayor has a difficult job, which wasn't answering the question. And it seemed sympathetic, but it was a complete turn to, a 90-degree turn. And the press was so stupid, they didn't say, yeah, but you didn't answer the question. So, I mean, he got him on that. But The Guardian, every few years, they'd republish this in larger and larger print. And so I'm hoping they're going to run it again. We'll see. But, would I have made as big a splash? No, having Miami in the name of South Miami was just total dumb luck. If it had been its original name, the town of Larkins, this never would have happened. I mean, I still would have talked about climate and stuff, but I wouldn't have gotten the attention, the undue attention that I got because I was the mayor of dinky little South Miami.
We want to hear if any of you have questions. Are there microphones here, or are there written down questions? All right. If there are any written questions, we'll be happy to take those. And those of you who are watching on streaming, you can also submit your questions as well. And let me have a couple of those while you harvest some more. Go ahead, please.
While we're waiting there, I got to take this opportunity to slam Marco Rubio again. More seriously, I mean, Rubio has made his whole career complaining about communism and Castro, and Castro's Cuba, and now he's taking his own political prisoners. I mean, having students arrested and sent to political prisons. How about that? Shame on Marco
He-
Rubio. And shame
He-
on Miami for having supported him in the first place. Got him his start. You know, became elected Speaker of the House of Florida by reducing teacher salaries, agreeing to reduce teacher salaries in urban areas. That's how he was able to pull together a coalition of Republicans to support him as Speaker.
Pete, may we ask a question from Zoom just quickly?
Yes, please.
So, as someone passionate about creating more green spaces in cities like my own Chicago, what advice would you give to a young person who wants to advocate effectively for these initiatives and bring them to life? This is directed primarily to Alex and Jesus.
I love to hear questions like that because I think it's really important for young people to think about how they can advocate for the change they want to see. Change is important. Change doesn't happen without a voice and somebody reaching out. I love when people email me or call me and they have a question and a change they want to see. I'm a public administrator. I believe in service to the community, and I'm always happy to have a conversation. And I would say that most people working in local government are interested in providing that same level of support. Go online. It's very easy to find contact information for your local government officials, whether they're elected or appointed, and ask those questions. Don't take no for an answer. I like to say that you just have to refine that question if you receive a no. I think it's very important to be mindful that a goal that a resident or a community member may have might not necessarily match the goal of the organization, but through multiple conversations and negotiations, it's important to impact that change.
Briefly, Jesus?
Yeah, I would say, to add to Alex's comment, identifying that space and understanding what it might take to obtain it, right? If it's a vacant lot or corner lot on your city block, what are the policies in place for residents to take over that lot, right? And then develop a plan. What's a vision for it? How is it going to be used? So it's really about educating yourself and creating some awareness, and again, reaching out to those individuals that can support and guide you through that process.
Alexandria, here's a follow question for you. Cleveland Metro Parks, this questioner says, has been tremendously successful in restoring once run-down parks, Edgewater being one such example. What best explains that success, and can it be more widely replicated?
Yes, as a former Cleveland Metro Parks employee, it was an honor to work for that organization. They do a phenomenal job branding their parks, having very thorough management plans, preventative maintenance plans, and working with their partners. That model absolutely can be replicated, and it has been replicated around the nation. Cleveland Metro Parks is an award-winning organization, and it's recognized by the National Recreation and Park Association, as well as by the American Academy for Park and Recreation Administration. It's definitely a model that should be mirrored, and there's a lot of lessons I learned from working for Cleveland Metro Parks that I look forward to employing on my current position with the City of Cleveland.
The question for you, Philip, is what kind of trees, let me read the question as it's written here. What are the best types of tree to plant to help the environment? And if I can just add to that, do broadleaf deciduous trees work as well as coniferous trees? Do they both do the little evaporative cooling routine?
Yeah, they all do. Now, rainfall's getting goofy, right? We're getting droughts when we shouldn't be getting droughts, and floods when we should be dry. So you want to plant trees that have some drought resistance. And I like to plant a fast and slow growing trees together, fast so you get some results quickly and inspire people, and slow for the long haul, things that'll last. And something we've learned from the tropical biologists, this is important to mix species so that if a pest comes through that's going to attack one thing, like the emerald ash borer, that you haven't planted only ash trees, right? Or you'd be sunk. So you want to have variety so that if some pest comes along, some of your trees survive. Those are your three things.
Yeah, there's a really cool resource actually that was in partnership with the Cleveland Metro Parks and Lubrizol called the Tree Finder tool. So it's for folks, whether you're trying to plant something in your backyard, it gives you, you can enter in kind of the specifications of what your environment is, your habitat that you're trying to plant, and it'll provide you with some suggestions in terms of best species for that.
Take this one step further. There's the Cuyahoga County Soil and Water Conservation District. They do a native plant sale every year. I think it's over. It ends usually in mid-March, but they have a ton of resources. Planting native species are really important. They use less water. They're used to our environment, and they tend to survive without as much wear and tear on our bodies and our psyche as exotic species or species from other places.
So these two questions go together, I think. The first one says, what are the biggest barriers, political, social, or economic, to implementing equitable environmental policies, and how can we overcome those challenges? And the second question says, how do policymakers effectively balance the urgent climate action needs with economic, political realities that often frustrate those goals in the short term?
Let's break that down again. So the first one had to do with essentially equity in allocation of efforts. Was that correct?
Yes.
And we know that there's communities that are in pretty bad shape and those that are in pretty good shape. You sort of, if you like divide the world in, in half, right there, you say, well, let's start here. Even within your neighborhood, there's places that need more attention than others. I mean, you were talking about this ravine, right, where the people were playing basketball. There's a lot of crap down at the bottom of that ravine, right? I mean, so there's areas you can find in your own community that's really easy. That's where you start your attentions. Is it any? And then there was a second half of that question.
Yeah, the second half is policymakers balancing the the environmental needs on the one hand and economic needs on the other. The idea that there's a trade-off between the two.
That's a false dichotomy, isn't it? You want to elaborate on that?
It's actually interesting. There's a professor out of Texas who talks about the economic benefits of parks and recreation facilities, whether it's tourism, regional tourism, local visitation, but there's a connection between parks and recreation and economic development. And I think we view it as two things that are separate and different. But if we change how we view economic development, adding park spaces, adding open spaces and gathering spaces is really important if we're building an urban type park. When we're looking at regional parks or destination type parks, those places still have an economic development opportunity available in those regions. And I think it's important that from a policy standpoint, that we help our elected officials and help policymakers understand there is a correlation between the two, and they go together just as well as socks and shoes.
Okay, so this is a question for you. This person says, I work as a teacher in the inner city. How do you incorporate the inner city into this debate? They are interested, the questioner says.
Yeah, I think, that's always a challenge, right? When you're thinking of an inner city, especially with the larger municipal school districts. Resources are often limited. Activities and things that teachers can do are often limited. So it is about, partnerships when I think about it. There are organizations and opportunities for schools and teachers to connect with these organizations that have these opportunities, whether it's, funding and dollars for field trips to get students out into the parks, right? So there's this initiative when I was part of the Conservancy called Every Kid Outdoors or Every Kid in the Park. And we provided funding for the schools on a reimbursement for them to bring their youth down into the national park for some activities and even just recreation time. There's other organizations that also will cover and provide funding and support and even, supplies and things like that for teachers to really engage. But I would also say that, you know, it doesn't have to be that grandiose, right? It can also be very simple, because I think, again, we separate this idea of nature, the outdoors, as like this other place, right? Maybe it starts with the tree in the schoolyard, or the you know, even the field in the schoolyard, and what kind of diversity you can find in terms of organisms there. So, you know, it really is about just having conversations, maybe collaborating with other teachers across content, and other organizations.
Pete, may we take one more question from Zoom just quickly?
Please do.
Apologize. So this would be a lightning round question, and then I'm sure we have one more from our audience here. So what is one piece of advice that you would give to people concerned for the environment? So each panelist, one piece of advice in this current political environment for people concerned with the environment.
Think global, act local.
I would say take action, right?
Just along those same lines, first thing that popped in my head was get involved. Don't be afraid to get involved.
What does think global, act local mean, Philip?
It means pick an issue that's going to resonate outside of your own little space. You know, an issue that's big. But you know, work on it in your community where it's tractable for you, where you can engage partners and get the resources you need to make it, you know, to make a difference that people can see and set an example. It's you know, this is about amplification, right? If you can make a visible difference, people will see it and they'll get inspired. I mean, that's why I, as mayor, put solar panels on my house so people would see it. It's why I planted my yard the way I did, because I like it. And I get a 90% tax break, it turns out, because I've got all these native plantings, which is fabulous. But it inspires people. I meet people all over the Southeast who say, I've been to your house and seen your yard. And I've got a terrible memory for names and faces, but they all remember the house and yard. And it just inspires people. And it's this inspiration of doing something spectacular at a small scale that is going to resonate into the bigger world and make a difference.
Well, we're out of time, but let me just ask for a round of applause for two reasons. One is for their performance today as speakers, but secondly, what they are doing to help the environment. Thank you all very much.
We want to thank you all for joining us this evening, and thank you to those that have joined us by Zoom. We had over 800 people on Zoom tonight, so our audience is exponential compared to those in the room. This concludes our spring series on this conversation on Laudato Si and envisioning a livable future. But don't miss us as we pick back up in September in the next academic year. So thank you again for your time, and thank you to our wonderful panel and moderator.